Brian, I'm an alcoholic. It's great to be here with y'all. This is a nice big podium. I think it's huge. I may not even spill the coffee there if I set it up like that. But thank you for the introduction there, and I'm grateful to be here. I've known some of you guys 26 plus years, and I'm very grateful for that, and grateful for the men and women who brought me here all those years ago when you guys were just getting started. I think Daniel said the group started in '97. Is that right? So my sponsor was a good friend of Tom's, and they were driving us over from Wilson, where I crash landed back at Mom and Dad's house with my drinking. Is where I ended up, as in Wilson, North Carolina. There was what I didn't know when I crash landed. There was an excellent AA group there, with a lot of really men and women who were serious about their sobriety and carrying the message. And so that's how I got here to Southern Pines, was being carried to meetings all days of the week. And I had drank my way out of college, and my parents were allowing me to live on their couch if I didn't drink. And I was adhering to that for the most part, although I did continue to drink for a period of time undercover before I got sober. And but once I got sober, we got into action and started doing stuff like this and coming out to groups like this. And so it's really, really cool to think back on that and to be a part of it. So, but real grateful. I think last time I was here, Steve offered to say a prayer before the meeting, but he was very long-winded, and so we ended up coming in after the meeting had started. So I was kind of glad that we sort of missed the pre-meeting prayer this time. I didn't walk in late, but I appreciate the willingness to do that and all that. But I was running a few minutes behind the road I come over on was closed for a bridge or something, so it threw me off by about 10 or 15 minutes, but I still had plenty of time to spare, and really grateful to be here at a meeting. I love AA speaker meetings, not necessarily ones that I'm the speaker at, but when I get to sit in the audience and just listen to an alcoholic talk about their drinking and their recovery. I just love that. I do enjoy it. Even people I've heard a lot of times, I don't mind hearing them again and again. In fact, sometimes it sort of gets better, and I don't think we change our stories, but our understanding and our experience gets deeper. Our experience gets bigger, and our understanding, I think, gets deeper. And as you sort of walk down the spiritual life of this thing. So, because I've been listening to some people, my sponsor included, for over 25 years. I mean, no telling how many times I've heard him speak, and as I've heard others as well during that time. And it's nice, we talk about how powerful one alcoholic, sharing with another alcoholic is. The idea of the speaker meeting setup seems to be exactly what you would need for that kind of identification to occur, is having someone share their experience. I'm hoping that someone will have that experience here tonight, maybe can identify with something in my drinking or my recovery that'll let you either take hold of this thing, get sober, or maybe dig a little bit deeper into recovery here if you can. So I want to thank the group for being here. Very grateful to get the job. Couple little things. I'm a member of the Cleveland 12-step group. I was a member of the Willow Springs group in Fuquay for many years, over 20 years, and went through an arduous process of changing home groups, and moved over to the Cleveland 12-step group, which meets in Johnston County out near I-40. If you're just south of Raleigh out there, is where my home group is. And we meet Wednesday nights. It's a group that meets once a week, and it's an excellent AA group. It was a group that attracted me because of the kind of message they were carrying. It was painful for me, and I won't lay this on you guys here tonight, but I think some people make decisions too quickly and too rashly. Like, I've seen people just sort of willy-nilly leave home groups and change sponsors and stuff. I absolutely wore my sponsor out changing that home group. I think he was so grateful when I finally made the decision. I quit calling him about it. I almost got the sense at the end, like I can't believe we're talking about this again, are we? The idea of changing home groups. But home group means a lot to me. And it means more and more the longer I'm sober. And so, again, I think people have different ideas about that. I'm not saying I'm right or wrong, but it was a big deal for me to leave a group I'd been a member of many years. But I felt like that group, for whatever reason, and I'm not suggesting I'm right about this, it's just the way I see it, had failed to grow. Not only had failed to grow, but it seemed like it was actively shrinking. In fact, it was. And didn't seem like we could stem the tide on that. And I don't know whether some folks weren't concerned about it or just weren't even aware of it, and then there were some of us that were, and so I just decided to take my energy somewhere else. And I'll own that, because I was a member of that group for a long time, so perhaps, I'm part of whatever may have been wrong with that group. I don't know, but I'm grateful for the group I'm in now. It seems to be a group that is growing and attracting alcoholics, and that's what we're doing. So my sobriety date is April 2nd, 1997, and Yeah, and I look back on that now, and I can't, when I look back on April 2nd of 1997, I took my very last drink at a happy hour at an Embassy Suites, because at that time, you didn't get carded nearly as badly, and I wasn't even 21 years of age at that time, but I could always slide into a happy hour at a fancy hotel and sort of pretend like I was staying there, and they would serve you beer at happy hour. And so I had a number of beers that particular night, went into a blackout, and I don't think I had a lot to drink, not like I normally would have, but I can remember sort of coming out of that fog of the blackout. And then I never drank again after that. And I think if I had known that was going to be my last run at drinking, I probably would have had a lot more. Isn't it funny how it works out that way? But I had been making some attempts up until that time to quit drinking, and so my drinking had gone underground, so to speak, at that time. It was unacceptable to everybody around me, including me to some extent, but I was still kind of dabbling in that a little bit. But that was the last time I drank, was April 1st, 97, and then got sober after that. So it is strange, I crash landed at Mom and Dad's house in Wilson. I was a college student. I thought myself I fancied myself sort of an intellectual because I had been in college, But the reality was I didn't even earn any college credits while I was there. I had nothing to show for it. Even though I'd been in college, and of course my ego tells me I'm smarter than everybody else, and it also tells me that the rules are fine for all of y'all, but the rules don't really apply to me. I should always get a pass, and so I had been a college dropout, is what I would call myself, I guess. But I was living back at Mom and Dad's house. I didn't really know what to do with myself. They didn't know what to do with me either. And I had been using, and I'll confine my remarks to my alcoholism here, but I do like to make this point because I think there are other alcoholics that have had a similar experience. But I had been dabbling in a number of other substances over the years, in addition to drinking. I mean, I just love something that's going to make me feel different. And I wanted more of whatever that was. But I threw all that in with my drinking as well. And I landed in a treatment center in the winter of 1996 when I came home, when I dropped out of college and sort of dried out in there and never touched another drug since December of 96. And here I am with the wise idea thinking, well, I was 19 years old at the time. And I thought, how can you be an alcoholic? I'm not even 21 years of age. At which, you could make an argument around that. You probably shouldn't be an alcoholic unless you're 21 years of age. But we didn't have any trouble getting alcohol at that time. It may be harder now with the way they do IDs. I've got teenage kids now. And if you're under 21, I think they're vertical. They're different, like you're vertical and horizontal, I think, if you're like that. So they're much harder to fake. Back then, they were like laminated or whatever they were. I don't remember the old paper ones or anything like that. Some of you may remember those, but the old ones were laminated like that. But we always had, we could always get alcohol to drink back then and stuff. So, but I thought, well, here's the great experiment I'm going to try is I'll leave all the other stuff alone and I'll just continue to drinking because that other stuff was my problem. And I've heard other alcoholics share that, so I'll just share that experience with you. And so that was what I set out to do. I got out of the treatment center mid-December of 96. And was grateful to be dried out from the other stuff, and then took to drinking and was trying to find a way to regulate that. And that's when I said my drinking had kind of gone underground at that time. It wasn't as open. And I was also actively hiding it from my parents as well. so having to hide it around you. The thing about drinking in a where you're not supposed to be, there's always an idea that you've got to hide your bottles, whether it was beer or whiskey or whatever it was. But if you're also not supposed to be drinking, you have to hide the empty ones as well. And that was much harder for me to do. You can't leave a trash can full of empty bottles. There's evidence that there was alcohol in them. So I had a whole scheme about getting it in and out of the house at that time. But what happened for me was my drinking just took off in a rapid fashion during that time. And so I had no control with just the drinking is what I was hoping to find. I could still go for periods of maybe 2 weeks without taking a drink. But I don't think I ever went any longer than that. And if I did, it was the same kind of thing. I never wanted just a few. I got as many as I could. And so I just sort of fast forward to my last, to the car accident that sort of brought me in Alcoholics Anonymous. So this 3 or 4 month experiment with drinking only, I had been hanging out at a friend's house in just east of Wilson, which is in a place called, I think it's called Saratoga. It's out there toward Greenville, and I had this old beat up truck that I had, and I'd been drinking. We'd been drinking on the way to Greenville. Driven to Greenville, drank on the way there, came back, and late at night, and I'm leaving her house, and I got out on one of those old country roads to get back into to Wilson City proper there, and just drove the truck down in the ditch on the right side, and then it ended up sort of spinning around, flipped over the road, and ended up pointing back the other direction on the other ditch, on the other side of the road. And it happened before I even knew what was going on. You know, I remember being pulled off the steering wheel and hitting the passenger side door. It's one of those old trucks that had those bench seats. You know, they just went straight across. It was not a nice truck at all. It was like a 1986 old Ford thing that was all beat up. But and it rolled over, and I'm sitting there with all the trash from the floor, you know, beer cans around me and all this stuff. And I didn't hardly know what happened. I could see the CD player up there was still on, and the blinker was on, but the engine had cut off, and the lights were still on. And so my first idea was, I got to get out of here. You know, I don't know where I am, but let's hope I can get out of here. Because it was pretty clear, pretty quickly, I was not injured. And again, a lot of people die in those kind of rollover. I didn't have a seatbelt on, and nobody was with me, thank God. But people kill other people a lot in rollover accidents like that. But again, for whatever reason, here I am, I'm completely unharmed. And my plan was, I was a few miles out of Wilson. I figured I could walk my way into town, because we didn't really have cell phones. I didn't have a cell phone then, but they weren't as prominent. But I thought maybe I could get out of there, was my plan. It was late at night. And when I climb out of the vehicle, I'm right in someone's front yard. And they had already called, you know, what's what you do when someone flips their car into your yard is you call the police and an ambulance, you know. And of course, I was upset by that. I was trying to get out of there. But there was nowhere to go. It was too late at night. It was too dark. It was seemingly in the middle of nowhere. And so, you're waiting there. You can start to hear the sirens coming, you know, and all that. I thought the game's up now. You know, I had missed a number of DWIs over the years that I should have had. Again, my ego told me that I didn't get those because I was different and special, and that other people get busted drinking and driving, and I don't. I mean, my ego told me that on some level, that I was special, and I wouldn't. The rules didn't apply to me in that regard, and so that's what happened for me. The highway patrol came, the ambulance came, fire truck, everybody's out there. I'm totally fine, thank God, nothing wrong with me. The truck is just totaled upside down in the ditch out there, and someone got a hold of my parents. I don't know how they got a hold of my parents. I guess I can tell you this, probably the registration of the vehicle, because I certainly didn't own that vehicle. My parents did. So someone probably called my parents from the tags or whatever and got them out there. But I didn't deserve this. Again, my ego told me that I did at the time. It sort of confirmed what I always thought, that I was special and the rules were okay for you guys, but not for me. I didn't get a DWI that night. That state trooper let me go home with my parents that night. And but for me, even though without getting the legal consequences I should have had from that, it was the thing that put me in Alcoholics Anonymous full time. I realized that I had been coming to some AA meetings since I got out of that treatment center a few months ago, and had been sort of dabbling and peeking in on AA. Didn't have a sponsor, I didn't have a home group, and I knew, just intuitively, I had very few sort of clear thoughts in my head at that time as a newcomer, but I knew that next time I would get the DWI, or I would be underneath the truck when it rolled over, or someone else would be. And I just had sort of a moment of clarity, which I rarely ever had. And I made the decision when I got back to my parents' house that night that I would go back to that AA group that met in Wilson and ask one of those men that I saw sitting around the front table to be my sponsor. And so, it's funny, it takes what it takes for us to get here, but I mean, that's not all that crazy a story, but it's what did it for me in the very end. I had actually been in a much worse place, sort of physically and emotionally, about a year before with my drinking and some of the other stuff I was doing, in terms of just wanting to die and feeling like life was over and not imagining life without a drink. But I dried out in that treatment center, and my drinking never got back to the level it did before that. Even that few months I was drinking at the end. So it's, you always wonder what it's going to take for someone, what disaster or what, but mine ended up being a break that I got in that regard. And so I went back, and Steve Mitchell is my sponsor, and I've had him ever since that next night, whenever that was. That was sometime in mid-March of 97. Then I drank a couple of more times after I had him there at that happy hour before I completely sobered up. But it was that car accident that got me in there. And I remember talking to Steve before the speaker meeting, and I said, I need a sponsor. He knew me because I'd been coming to the group a little bit. And he said, well, let's talk about it. And so we rode around downtown Wilson after the speaker meeting, and he asked me a bunch of questions that we all ask people we sponsor today. Are you willing to go to any length? Are you willing to work the steps? I don't really know what else we talked about. I was not one of those newcomers that sort of knew what was going on. He said we worked the steps, and I really didn't even know what that meant, about what working the steps meant. And but what he ended up telling me was that we would read the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and they had written that book to show other people how to work those 12 steps. It was sort of the long and short of it. And I had run out of ideas. I haven't sort of shared with you all the things I've tried. I don't know that I need to necessarily, but if you're like me, AA certainly wasn't where I thought I was headed, in life. When I got out of high school, I thought I'm going to college and, I'll set the world on fire. But that was not it. My drinking cut me down, and I don't know why. I think in my sobriety, I have been both prideful of getting sober when I was young, and then embarrassed by it. That I didn't drink long enough, but you can drink enough in 4 or 5 years to get full-blown alcoholism. It's just my experience, I can assure you I didn't get here on any kind of moral grounds or the idea that drinking was wrong. In fact, if I could have continued drinking without just loathing myself or just completely destroying my life, that's what I would have been doing then. That's what I'd be doing tonight if I could do that. But I just couldn't find a way to do it. But I think, just like everything else, as we continue to work the steps and try to help others, I think that our humility grows, perhaps. And so I found sort of the middle ground with that, because people used to say, you're so lucky you got sober so young. And I was grateful. It wasn't that I was ungrateful that I got sober young, but it almost had the sense that, my ego would interpret it like, well, of course, I would get sober young. I knew that I needed help and I needed to get sober and all that. And that's not really the way it was. The truth of the matter was, for whatever reason, 19 years of age, my drinking had destroyed my life where I was willing to look for something different. I don't know why it happened for me then, and it happens for other people at different times, but that's kind of I think that's the middle ground between my ego and my fear about that you get here when you get here. I don't know why that I got here at that particular time. I'm grateful that I did, and I'm also very grateful I've been able to stay here too. But I tried all the tricks. I'd been a psychiatrist. I did believe in better living through chemicals, and so I figured there wouldn't be any chemical a doctor couldn't give me that would find a way to sort of level me out. And so I tried the psychiatry route, and that didn't help, and all of that stuff. But I just loved to drink, and for me, the drinking did so much for me in the beginning. It was very difficult for me to see at the back end that it was causing all the trouble. In fact, at the very end, when I landed in that treatment center, and they're going over all the problems you've been in, asking you how you've been drinking, all that kind of stuff. For me, the alcohol for me, even I kept a little bottle of whiskey by the bed, it let me sleep at night. Sometimes the chaos in my mind would be calmed by a few shots, and then I could lay down and go to sleep at night. And it was very difficult for me to sleep as when I first got sober. It was one of the things I really struggled with, because if you pass out enough nights in bed, it's hard to go to sleep without it. So to me, alcohol in a very delusional way still looked like the solution. And I think that's why the big book talks about, it's in the third step, it's in some other areas of the big book too, that we live through self-compulsion, self-centeredness, self-delusion. That's part of us. And that was true for me. I just could not see the true from the false. To me, the drinking seemed like it was what was my last friend, in other words. And that if either people treated me differently. I blamed the dorm I lived in college for a fair bit of my drinking, because it was so wild. I thought, well, everybody in there is drinking like that all the time, and I'm just keeping up with the crowd, is what I thought. So I blamed, other people and other places for the way my drinking was. And it just didn't dawn on me that it was me. There was something inside me that was wrong that made me part of that. And I certainly don't have an answer for you here tonight why that's true. But for me or not, I came from good parents. My parents are both deceased now, but they're both good, hardworking, principled people. And I was always amazed by that. They raised me, to understand principles and to try to live an honest, hardworking kind of life. And for some reason, both myself and my younger brother just went full-fledged in alcoholism. I watched my brother, who is now sober, thank God. His alcoholism took it much further, much longer than I did. But it's very strange how that would sort of work out. And again, it's one of those things that I can't answer tonight about why I have alcoholism or why I even got sober, at that time. I think I know the things that I've done to maintain the sobriety, certainly in that regard. But, I was just an innocent kid. My parents were hardworking people. My mother was an elementary school teacher, and my father started out as a manager of department stores and ended up being self-employed in the plant and nursery business a later part of his life. He was a very hard worker. But they didn't drink in the house. They very rarely ever drank themselves. I was not somebody that was raised in an alcoholic kind of home or environment. Nor was I raised in a home that was against it either. It was just sort of a non-factor. But as I came of age as a teenager, my parents had a huge stash of untouched liquor bottles that they had been given over the years for holiday gifts and birthday parties and just their own kind of stuff. So I had access to this huge stash that my parents had no idea what was in there. And I mean, it was a big stash. When you're a 13 or 14-year-old kid and you get a whole closet full of just liquor bottles that no one is keeping any inventory on. I mean, that's where my drinking started. And I don't blame that closet full of liquor bottles, but it certainly helped get me going. And so even before drinking was a problem for me, I would take a Pepsi can, pour half of it out, and pour a little vodka on top of it, and go from there. But I love the way alcohol made me feel. It took away the fear. It took away the awkwardness for me. And again, it was as baffling to me that somehow something that made me feel that good and did that much for me would then destroy my life in just a few years. And I think that's where the delusion happened for me. I just couldn't understand that it could do that. So, but it did. I think I was probably a full-blown alcoholic before I ever got out of high school. I'd been seeing a psychiatrist and trying to find different ways to regulate my drinking even in high school. And then once I hit college, it was just wide open. It was just absolutely wide open. And so I did think, I went to school at Appalachian State in Boone, which at that time was 4.5 hours from Wilson. And I did have the idea that a geographic cure would work. And it sounded so reasonable and so logical at the time that if you move towns, you get a new set of friends, you surround yourself in a new environment, that I wouldn't drink so much. And I'd get back to trying to be a student, because by the time I was a senior in high school, all bets were off. I mean, I wasn't doing any work, any reading, drinking every night, partying all the time. And I had fancied myself at one time a good student and things like that, and sort of would have liked to have gotten back to it. And even then I could see the writing on the wall, and the drinking was taking over areas of my life that had been important before. But anyway, it got much, much worse. You can imagine that geographic cure that I thought would help was an immediate disaster, because when I got to college, again, I moved right into a dorm that seemed like you could drink just around the clock. And so my drinking went from something I would do like Thursday to Sunday to just 7 days a week, because there's always something going on, at least that I found on that college campus, where you could drink. And not only that, but I fell in with the crowd there that drank like I did, that we would stay up all night long and drink. And it always felt good under the cover of darkness, You run around campus or run around downtown Boone in and out of bars and stuff, and it just feels wild and fun. And then, as the sun starts to come up, all that, gets much, it doesn't look nearly as good as the sun comes up, And the birds start chirping, and life begins to happen around you, and it just feels hard. You begin to feel like an alien then. But I would do that day after day after day. We'd stay up and do that over and over again. And so that's why I ended up, just failing out of college, because you do that enough days in a row, and I kept telling myself, I'm not going to drink tonight. I'm going to get a night's rest, and I'll go to class the next day. And I could never do that. I just never could do that. And I can remember hearing people, because we're in a dorm environment, it's close. You guys, it's like being in a hotel or whatever, but you can hear things. And we would be up all night, a group of us drinking. Sun's coming up, we're trying to find a way to keep the party going. And you can hear alarm clocks going off, and you can hear people going to get in the shower, and people coming out of the shower and getting dressed and grabbing their book bags and walking down the hall to go to class. And it was like I couldn't even figure out how they did that. I mean, I had just gotten to the point of just that, the depth of my alcoholism. It was like I couldn't figure out how to set an alarm clock. Well, first of all, not drink the night before, set an alarm clock, get up and be responsible. My alcoholism had just taken over all motives of that, any good motives I had or ability to do that. And it seems crazy today. Like, how could you not just put it down for a few nights and get up and go to class? Well, when you're in the thick of it, you just couldn't. And I remember thinking, I just was baffled that there were people doing that, because here I am with this group that was not doing that and drunk all the time. So anyway, that was my drinking. And when I dropped out of college, that was the absolute worst of my alcoholism. I mean, I was nearly suicidal. I wanted to die. It was just a horrible, horrible time. I've been ripping off my family. I've been wrecking their vehicles. had been, just treating them so selfishly at that time. And then grateful that I got in that treatment center, as I suggested earlier. I got in there and dried out on the other stuff and then got sober. I do want to make a point, because sometimes our AA stories sound so orderly. And it kind of goes with what I sort of led off with here tonight. But, I ended up lying about my sobriety date for the first 9 months of my sobriety. And, sometimes when we speak or you hear people's, stories sound perfect, like they've never made a mistake and that kind of stuff. And I'm not one of those that says that. I've certainly made some mistakes. But I ended up lying about my sobriety date until sometime almost late within my first year of sobriety. And I can tell you this, and alcoholics will understand this. I don't know if there's some family members here tonight and things like that, but there is a delusion, I think, that goes with alcoholism that looks unexplainable. It looks like it's just irrational or something. But for me, I was telling everybody I got sober in December of '96 when I got out of the treatment center. I didn't change my sobriety date at all. I just kept saying that's what it was. And so I really quit drinking April of '97, 4 months later. But I continued to tell that sobriety date into almost the end of 1997. So people were thinking that, I'm coming up on a year of sobriety. Well, for a while, so was I. I was thinking, I'm coming up on a year of sobriety. And this is where this is why I think that there's a power in Alcoholics Anonymous and power in working the steps and prayer and all that stuff. Because one day I remember walking to class, I had the opportunity to get sober and go back to college and try to earn some of those credits that I had missed the first time. And this is my recollection. I'm walking to class, it's cold, it's early in the morning, and it hit me like a bolt of lightning that I had been lying about my sobriety date all that time. Until that moment, I think I would have passed a lie detector. I was in a delusion about that. It was not, I don't think I was actively or consciously lying about that sobriety date. It was just what it was until that point. But when that thought, whether that was God or whatever, it's a spiritual life moving in my life, it hit me. And of course, the first thing I think is, that's not that big a deal. We're going to slide that under the rug, Nobody cares, right? That's not a big deal. And so I justify it that day, and then I wake up the next day, and there it is again. You've been lying about your sobriety date. I thought, man, no, I'm going to figure out a way around this. My mind's churning ways around it. And so the third day I wake up with that thought, you've been lying about your sobriety. And now, mind you, I've been very active in AA all this time and have a home group in Boone where I'd moved at that time. And I'm very happy about my sobriety, in fact. I mean, it's not like I wanted to drink then, but it became clear that I was going to have to come clean about that with my sponsor and with the people I knew in Alcoholics Anonymous. And so it just goes to show people struggle with that. I know other people have had issues with that sometimes. And in hindsight, it's not all that big a deal, but it just shows you how crazy we can be, and how weird we can be. It's been a while since the newcomer completely baffled me with some of their weirdness, because I was full of it. And so I can remember rushing back into the dorm room, and we still had sort of landlines back then. And I picked up the phone and called Steve. I said, Steve, I've been lying about my sobriety date. And that's where the conversation went from there. And it wasn't that big a deal. Didn't shock him, I'm sure he's heard that before. But that was the kind of thing, if I hadn't gotten right with that, it's the principle of honesty began to move in my life. If I hadn't moved with it, I would have drank again, I suspect, or something, something bad would have happened at that point. I think once we begin to violate those sort of spiritual principles as they move in our lives, you've either got to be willing to go with it and make that change, or you're going to backslide. And I didn't want to drink again. I really didn't, even though it sounds crazy, and it was weird explaining that to my sponsor about how that happened. But it was just a step on the road for me getting honest. And I can tell you, there were still a number of other things that I was dishonest about, not necessarily consciously, but that came to me later. Things I told, things that some of the behaviors I had, went on for several years before they became objectionable to me. But that's just the most obvious example of that. And so when I asked Steve to be my sponsor, he said, we're going to work the steps. And so we went on and we read the book. Steve was single at that time, and he was living in Wilson. I was unemployed, living in Wilson with my parents, and had plenty of time to go to meetings. And so we started working the steps. And so I went through and did an inventory that summer, and went in and began making amends and all that. I'll tell you a little bit about the fourth step. When I saw that, I thought, again, here I am, a college dropout. This is like homework. I'll do well at this. I know how to write is what I thought. But I remember thinking to myself that I wouldn't have any defects of character. I thought, I drank too much, I got out of line, all that kind of stuff. But I didn't understand those defects of character were inside me in a way until I did that inventory. Again, it seems crazy and stupid and delusional, but it's just my story that I could look at the fourth step and see, resentment, fear, relationships, and sex, and some of those problems around it. But it didn't make sense to me until I started writing that process. And that's why I think it's so important to write that sometimes. The excuse I used, I think I never told my sponsor this until many years later, and I'm so glad I didn't bring it up. But in my mind, here's what my ego and pride are telling me. I got sober at 19. I didn't drink long enough to get any defects of character, is what I thought. I thought some of you old, alcoholics that drank all those years, y'all are full of resentment and full of fear. But I was full of that too, but I didn't know. Just like with the dishonesty, I was unaware of some of that stuff. I was so full of fear about everything in my life. I think that's why I love to drink so much, and was consciously totally unaware of it. I think I knew feelings of anxiety and things like that, but the idea that I had fear, or was afraid to make decisions, or afraid of things in my life, I didn't see that until I did a fourth step. I was just so blind to that. I had some resentments, although I'm not particularly a resentful guy, but I certainly was able to see that kind of stuff. The main thing that I saw in my four-step inventory was some of the self-centeredness I had, some of the delusion, and then a lot of the fear too were things that came out of that. And thank God we went on and did that. Thank God I didn't tell Steve I didn't need to do a four-step. I just went on and begrudgingly did it and just opened up worlds. And, you grow from there. I mean, I didn't gain, some of these insights on that very first run through there, but it was the beginning of that stuff. I think we got to begin somewhere in terms of cleaning up our mind and cleaning up the spiritual life where that stuff can move. And that's what it's done for me. Just like that, getting honest about my sobriety day. Those things have continued to move in my life. Maybe not quite as drastic a fashion of that, but I spent years realizing how much I wanted to control other people and not being aware of that. Some of those things have come to me. I think the idea that, that the world owed me something had deep, deep roots well into my sobriety, much longer than I'd like to care to admit in the meeting here tonight. And different levels of that kind of stuff too, about where it was. But I think if you don't begin to scratch the surface on that stuff with an inventory, you don't ever see it, or you don't ever get down to it. And thank God, because I think those are the things that made me drink. I mean, that's it. I was obsessed with self, didn't know it, full of fear, didn't know it, completely dishonest, didn't know it. And so I think if we don't begin addressing some of those things, we're going to continue to live in that stuff. And so grateful for that, for going through there. And I'll just share a little bit about sobriety here. I can't believe that I'm still here in Alcoholics Anonymous tonight. All these years later, I'm grateful that I am, but certainly what I set out to do. Went back to college, had a chance to go back to App State, and so that's where I went. I joined a home group. I was a member of the Promises group, which met in Blowing Rock over there on Monday and Wednesday nights. And it was a good group, as good an AA group as you could find in that area at that time. We studied the 12 and 12 on Monday nights, and they did a big book study on Wednesday nights. And I couldn't drive as a freshman, and so the members of that group would come pick me up at the dorm and carry me over to the meeting on Monday and Wednesday nights. I'm real grateful for that. And most meetings were within walking distance of the dorm that I went back and lived in. But for me, I was one of those that went to meetings almost every single night. I don't think everybody has an individual adventure with that, but I wouldn't be able to go to meetings every single night now because I have a family and kids and stuff that wouldn't necessarily allow me to do that as much. But for me, sometimes AA meetings were the only refuge I got from my crazy head. And sometimes that fear would just spin so bad, and I think if I could just make it to the 8 o'clock meeting tonight, it'll quiet my head down. And it did almost every single time. And I'd be up there struggling with something in school and just frustrated, and I thought, man, if I can just make it to the meeting, I'll be okay. And so I used meetings heavily at that time as part of my sobriety, but had a home group. We used a lot of meetings too. So if you're new here, you're probably getting instructions from your sponsor about preparing meetings and being a home group member and showing up and taking your place and all that kind of stuff. And so I translated some of those instructions into school. I was grateful I had a chance to go back to college. I'd really blown it the first time. And in fact, I had to go back and go through an interview process with their counseling department to even get back in college. They had to make an assessment on me. And I'm grateful that they're willing to do that. My sponsor had me go back at the end of, I ended up graduating 4 years later, technically on time, I suppose, for somebody who had no prior credits at all. I went through it, and he had me go meet with that same department that had interviewed me to come back with my first withdrawal from school, and thank them for letting me back in large part because he said a lot of times those people in a counseling or psychological department see a fair bit of failure with that sometimes. And here, he's just making the point, and I'm just making the point, not bragging about it, I hope not, but just making the point that here is, someone who got sober in Alcoholics Anonymous and had an entirely different experience as a result of that. And I credit Alcoholics Anonymous for that, because I can assure you, I had the best of intentions when I went the first time drinking, and I got nowhere. I got absolutely nowhere, despite the best of my intentions to do differently. I just never could. I didn't have the power. I could not drink, and really didn't even realize that drinking was a problem at that time, but certainly could not drink. And then with Alcoholics Anonymous and God, I was able to go back and finish and do that. So it just shows you the power of this thing. And I think I'm always a little surprised when people don't take advantage of this. I mean, it can look like a weird spot. When I first came to AA, people were a lot older than me in most of the groups that I was in. But folks told me to listen and try to identify and not compare. See if you can identify with the drinking, and I could almost every single time with that. And so, really grateful. And I just had an entirely different experience. I've still got friends. I still sponsor a guy that I met up there, Tate. Some of you guys know Tate Way. He's probably been in this group a few years ago, but was able to do that. I met my wife there. My wife has never seen me drink. We ended up getting married right after we just celebrated our 22nd wedding anniversary last week, and we got married and we moved to Harnett County. And so I would say I moved to Harnett County and I just can't get out, but that's where I've been now since 2001, and it's been a great place to live and be, and it's a blessing of sobriety and Alcoholics Anonymous to have that. And so Kelly and I now have 2 teenage boys that are again blessings of Alcoholics Anonymous and sobriety. They have never seen me drink. When they were young, when your kids are a certain young, sort of cute age, they'll want to do everything with mom and dad. And so my oldest son, Harry, when I was chairing the speaker meeting at Willow Springs, he would come along every Thursday night. He'd help me set up the meeting. And I would always just tell him, I go to these meetings and I help alcoholics. And that's just what I tell them when they were young. I wasn't going to get into all of that with it. And so, but by the end of the month, Harry came up to me after the meeting. He said, "Dad, are you one of those alcoholics?" I said, "Well, I am one of those alcoholics, we come here together and do this." So but that's been his experience, and I'm grateful that he hasn't had to experience my alcoholism, because I'm as convinced today as I was 26 years or 27 years ago, that if my life is as different today as I could have ever imagined it. There's no evidence of my alcoholism. In fact, once most of us get sober for a few years, there's very little evidence of your alcoholism. Most of us get off, the legal trouble and the criminal trouble. We, physically we straighten out, we start working, we get a little bit of money. It's easy to look around and not see our alcoholism, and if you didn't know, if someone just looked in from the outside, they would know you're an alcoholic. And that's true for me today, and I'm grateful for that. But I know, and this may be whether it's a gift or a particular insight or whatever it might be, I'm as convinced that I'm just as much an alcoholic today as I was when I walked in here, and that my mind has been so crazy at times in sobriety. I don't know. So I think if I took one drink, it would blow everything up, but it wouldn't take all that long for me to get there. And so I've always been willing to come to Alcoholics Anonymous and stay an active member in it. What we're taught in the literature by those, if we don't do that, we might drink again. So our job now, if you've been here any length of time, is to carry that message and trying to help other people get sober. And so I sponsor a number of guys today. I watched Jerry Weaver and some other folks, my sponsor included too, sponsor a number of men over the years. And I don't sponsor as many men as those guys do, but my life has gotten very full of men of my own sponsees. And I spend often as much time outside the groups and meetings with them on the phone and meeting one-on-one as I do going to meetings. And I really like that. It's really just sort of a change of things, how that has shifted in my life, and how things have grown and been so different. But I think I've got to continue to stay right here in the middle of this thing. I mean, my job is to try to carry the message and be of service. This is the first time I've been down here since Tom died, last year. And so anytime I come down Highway 1, I was thinking about all the times Tom and I drove to the airport. Can you imagine how many times we drove to the airport from here to go make talks all over the world? it's amazing to think about the contributions of some of those members that they gave over the years, and seemingly how little that I have given. When I tried to always say yes to Alcoholics Anonymous when I'm asked to do that. But yeah, life is absolutely a gift of Alcoholics Anonymous today. We always say you should try to 12-step your physicians or professionals in your life, because there's a lot of misinformation about Alcoholics Anonymous. In fact, it seems like to me, I went back and went to law school, and I've been an attorney now a little over 20 years. But it seems like even the legal profession, in my small glimpse of the medical profession, Alcoholics Anonymous does not seem to be a factor of any kind. And I think it's very unfortunate, because at one time, I think people would try to make referrals to Alcoholics Anonymous, and doctors perhaps would make referrals, or attorneys. And the folks I deal with in the legal system in our area, it's not even a thought on somebody's radar. Now, they know, most of the attorneys I know that I am sober, and I still go to Alcoholics Anonymous. Some are baffled by that, because again, I haven't drank in a long time. But I think it's good to 12-step our professionals. And so, just to finish the point about not having any evidence of alcoholism, I tried to 12-step my doctor and convince him, look, I used to drink a lot, I'm an AA, if you ever have somebody that needs help, let me know. And I just can tell by looking at him, he doesn't believe me. It might as well be, like circus music playing in the background or something. But again, that's a gift of Alcoholics Anonymous, that I'm not there trying to scam him for a prescription, or my liver enzymes aren't off the charts, or whatever else, might have looked like when I was actively drinking and all that. So, but life is good today. I think if I stay right in the middle of this thing, that's where I'm going to continue to grow. When you look, I moved twice in sobriety. I moved to Boone when I was first sober, about 9 months or so, and then I moved back down to Harnett County 20 years ago. And you can kind of see things, in perspective if you look back. It's hard to see the difference day to day sometimes. Sometimes day to day, I feel like I made very little progress. But if you look back over a long period of time, you can kind of see that a little bit better. But I think for me, and I'll just sort of wrap up around this point here. I appreciate you guys' attention tonight, but to the point that the life is not always easy, but that Alcoholics Anonymous allows us to weather that storm. Most of the trouble that I've had in my sobriety, and I've had a few dark periods, they were very much self-imposed. And it seemed like it's self-imposed, you could stop it, But for whatever reason, I've had periods of real sort of dark depression and fear and anxiety. And I won't get into all that, but I had some periods that were very, very difficult. One at about 5 or 6 years, and then one, this was in 2013 into 2014. There was a time I couldn't even make an AA talk. I was so anxious I couldn't get up behind the podium, because I would start to hyperventilate and start to pass out. And I just share that for people, because sometimes life does get really weird and strange. Even in the middle of this thing, I think I had the idea that if I came to Alcoholics Anonymous and read AA literature and did all the right stuff, that maybe problems wouldn't happen to me. And I think to some extent, yeah, that's your best bet, is to keep all the jets of AA firing. Doesn't mean the tragedies of life won't hit us, deaths and family and whatever else other tragedies might be. But I've often found, I think for me, the main struggling point for me is thinking I've been sober too long to be having a particular problem, like fear, Like I'll be anxious about something, man, I can't still be anxious about this, I thought I dealt with this years ago, But sometimes that stuff continues to come up. And so I had a period would have been about 10 years ago now, where I had just tremendous anxiety. My body was vibrating and coming apart, and I was blissfully unaware of it. Almost like being unaware of the dishonesty. And so sometimes right in the middle of things, you can continue to be anxious, and you got to find a way to deal with that. I think it's made me more sensitive to some folks sometimes that have struggled, but I found my own way out of that. If anybody's interested in talking about that, I met a guy in Oklahoma last year who had very similar struggles, and he and I have been in touch ever since. I still think the best bet for me is to stay right here in the power of Alcoholics Anonymous, and it does power down those problems. It allows me to walk through the difficulties of life, that are going to come up, but it doesn't mean it's easy. It certainly doesn't. But I think for me, if I had not been in the middle of Alcoholics Anonymous during those dark periods, there were certainly times I didn't want to wake up. I didn't have any active plan for suicide or anything like that. But it was dark, and it's hard to think, here I am doing all the right stuff, how could that happen? And sometimes it does. And sometimes it's not necessarily that we're doing anything wrong either. And so that can be a real struggle. But I think the whole point of that, and I just finish up around this, is that I've got to be humble enough to realize that maybe I am struggling with that, and maybe I do need to talk to my sponsor about that. Maybe I haven't been sober long enough not to be afraid of that, or I haven't been sober so long that I'm not afraid to make that decision. some of those things continue to come up and struggle with. So for me, the best bet is to stay in the middle of this thing. It's what's held me in good stead so far. I have not wanted to take a drink in a very long time, and I'm very grateful for that. And it has allowed me to sort of walk down the other problems of life too. So appreciate you guys listening. Thanks, Dan.